Hello everybody. Today we'll be talking about tree biology. So let's get going. So we'll just quickly introduce just the ideas of what we're talking about today. Then we'll go over the anatomy of the tree, physiology, and then we'll finish with tropical trees and palms. So first of all, just very beginning. What's a tree? Because that's what we're talking about today. So we would define a tree as large woody plants with a single main trunk, although when we get to the ends of the slides we'll tell you about how that definitely can vary. Trees are usually perennial species. That's what separates them from what we consider like a typical agricultural crop. And one of the big things is just the amount of variation. We're going to see lots and lots of different types of trees. So it won't be surprising to learn that when we're learning about this stuff, we're going to kind of see some things that are going to be similar, but then find out, well, that happens in this tree, but not that tree, and that happens in that tree, but not this tree, and it's going to be a lot of variation. So in terms of this class, Introduction to Tree Care and Urban Forestry, the big overarching idea behind what we're learning about is arboriculture. And by the International Society of Arboriculture, that's the governing body for anybody who wants to be an arborist, they define arboriculture as the practice and study of the care of trees and other woody plants in the landscape. Now this is going to be both an art and a science, and in order to perform arboriculture, in order to be an arborist, one who can study and take care of trees and manage trees, you're going to have to need to know a thorough understanding of how they grow. And that's our goal today in talking about tree biology. So what is tree biology? Kind of simple, right? Hopefully these things aren't going to be too hard, but maybe for some of you this is all just very rudimentary and a lot of repeat, which is great. For some of you this is maybe the first time you're going over it or learning about it. Also, no big deal. We're going to cover it, and hopefully you get something out of it. So when we're talking about tree biology, we're talking about the study of the structure and function and the relationships between them within a tree. So how does all the stuff in the tree work? When we look at this notepad in the background, what's a terminal bud? What are lenticels? How can you tell this year's growth? What's a node? What's xylem? What's phloem? What's a cuticle, and why does a cell have a cuticle? It's all important ideas, and we're going to kind of go through every one of them. So let's start off with anatomy of a tree. And you can see there's quite a bit to it. We've got different parts, different leaves, different types of trees, all those sorts of things. So how can we kind of simplify it? Well, we're going to start at the basic structure, the cells and the tissues. So they are arranged in specialized zones called meristems. There's a process of differentiation which allows cells to change their structure to do specific functions. The cells are going to be arranged in tissues. So we're starting off at the very bottom, or at the smallest. We're in the cells. The cells are then arranged in tissues such as bark or wood. The tissues are then going to be arranged in organs, which allows us to get our leaves, our stems, our roots, our flowers, and our fruits. So, in terms of the meristems, we have primary meristems or apical meristems. Both of those words are interchangeable when it comes to the meristem, and those take care of our primary growth. So that meristem is in charge of the elongation of shoots and roots. So it's either in the bud. So if we look at our picture right up here, it says a vegetative bud. Right in here is our apical meristem. So at the end of our branches, we're going to have vegetative buds, and those buds are where the new material will emerge from. This will also happen in the root cap, as well as we also will be growing roots at the same time. So those are our primary meristems. We also have secondary meristems, or lateral meristems, and that's doing secondary growth. The secondary growth is the increase in diameter in the trunk, and this is the part that produces wood. So you can see right here with the vascular cambium how it's showing our lateral meristem, and we'll keep adding layers and layers and layers, which allow this growth in diameter. So here is our lateral meristems, and we're gonna focus on this whole area right here, that vascular cambium. That's our layer of growth. And we've got our bark, which is going to protect our tree, and we've got our sapwood, which is also known as xylem, as long as it's conducting water. So there's xylem and phloem. So let's talk about xylem first. So xylem is the wood of the tree. Well, what do you mean it's the wood of the tree? I mean, it's the wood of the tree. When we talk about a stem and we talk about the wood in the stem, we're really talking about the xylem for the most part. So it's got 4 primary functions. It's going to conduct water and dissolved minerals. It's going to support the weight of the tree. It's going to be a storage unit for carbohydrate reserves. And it's also going to provide us defense against the spread of disease. So that's 4 really awesome functions that xylem does. Within the xylem, that's where we're going to be able to see growth rings. And in terms of growth rings, I'll show you a picture in a minute. We're going to have early wood and late wood. And what's nice about that is the growth during the spring is separated from the growth during the summer, and we'll be able to see that difference. And because we can see that difference, we can start to make out annual growth in the growth rings, and we're able to figure out how old the tree is because we can see that growth repeated over and over again each year. On the pictures we saw before, we saw, say, sapwood and heartwood. Sapwood is xylem that's conducting water. Heartwood is the wood that's no longer conducting water or dissolved minerals. So if it's active growing wood, it's xylem. It's sapwood. If it's xylem that is not conducting any wood anymore, that's just called heartwood. We don't really consider it xylem. So going back to the idea of early wood and late wood, the light rings in this example are early wood. So right here where we see this light color wood, that's going to be the early wood. The darker part, like this darker part right here, are the slower growing, denser late wood. So one light ring, one light early ring plus one dark late ring comprises one growth ring or one annual ring, and it represents 1 year of growth. Some species, you're not going to be able to see that. Tropical trees, we'll talk about that towards the end, but tropical trees, more than likely, you will not be able to see that growth. So phloem. So we said xylem and then phloem. So in terms of phloem, phloem's main job is to move carbohydrates or sugars produced in the leaves throughout the tree for storage and use. So what you have with the xylem is pulling water up through the tree, and you got the phloem moving the sugars from the leaves into the tree. So you got one that's pulling it up from the roots and from the soil, and the other one that's taking it from the leaves and moving it into the tree. We also have bark. Phloem is sometimes referred to as inner bark, and what we think of as bark is outer bark. And so bark is the outer covering of the tree's branches and stem, composed of protective tissue. You can also sometimes get bark on roots as well. And then on our, what we could also see within the bark or in gaps in the bark is we might see lenticels. And lenticels are small pores in the bark for gas exchange. So looking at a picture of what we're talking about here, so this part right here, that's the part that we usually see and we call the bark of the tree. That's our outer bark. The phloem is our inner bark. We've got our xylem, our sapwood. We've got our cambium layer, so that's our meristem, our lateral meristem, where we're adding more growth to the diameter of this tree. So we've got our sapwood, and then we've got our heartwood, so here we're no longer conducting water. We're just we've got the wood that doesn't conduct water. And here, this is our xylem, where we are conducting water and minerals and taking things through the trees. We mentioned lenticels before, so if you look closely at the bark of a lot of different kinds of trees, whether you're looking at the twigs or the branches or the main stem, you'll see little dots. And the dots can look in lots of different patterns. Some have like diamond patterns, some it's just kind of like a long line. Sometimes it's just little dots. I mean, it's almost it's almost some sort of like tree braille or something. But they're all just pores, basically, to allow for gas exchange to happen. So the idea of taking in CO2 from the atmosphere and turning it into oxygen, that happens through the lenticels. So let's kind of go over some other parts of the tree. So some people don't. Some people kind of use some of these terms interchangeably, but I like to. I see them a little bit differently. So twigs. So if you're kind of out here on this diagram, out here would be a twig. So you got your twig part right here, this part that's a little different colored to the rest. That happens sometimes in some trees where the newer growth will be a different lighter color than the rest. So twigs are small stems that support leaves or flowers, flowers, and fruit. Whereas a branch then would be this thing. A branch will support twigs, and then you have the bole, the trunk or the stem, the main part of the tree, that then supports the branches. You'll hear limbs, and limbs is kind of a more general term for either a branch or a twig, but leaves, flowers, or fruits connect to the twigs. Twigs connect to the branches. Branches connect to the bole or the trunk or the stem, whichever term you want to use. And then we've got our roots down below. In terms of different parts of the plant, in terms of the leaf and the twig, we talked about those lenticels before. So here's an example of just some lenticels that we can see on the twig. You'll have in terms of buds. So we talked about the idea of this tree growing, and so what you'll have is a terminal bud at the end here, and that's the one where the twig will extend on and grow from. You also have axillary buds, where we've got growth happening off to the side of our tree, because when we see stems, we don't just see, well, I mean, some places we see where it just kind of shoots straight out, but for the most part we see it shoot straight out because the tree wants to grow, but then also it needs to put out leaves to be able to capture sunlight. So you've got both your terminal bud and your axillary buds. And so then you get these other terms where you get a node and an internode. So a node is a place where you'll see one of these axillary buds. And then the space in between the axillary buds is the internode. You'll also, if you have a place where a bud used to be but is not there anymore, you'd have a bud scar left. So on the left here, looking at it differently, we've got our main stem, we've got our axillary bud, we've got a node here, then we've got an internode to the next one, then we've got an internode to the next one, internode to the next one. And then we've got our terminal bud here, our apical bud or our terminal bud at the end. And that's the one that's doing that primary growth. That's our primary meristem that we talked about before. And then just the idea of roots and shoots that we talked about. So kind of looking at it the other way, we talked about the idea of the apical bud as our doing our primary growth. This is our root system doing our primary growth, and then there's also lateral roots coming off the side. And then a big part of trees, of course, are the leaves. And so the leaves are the food producers of the tree, and that's through the process of photosynthesis. So the big reason that the leaves do photosynthesis is because the leaves contain chloroplasts. The chloroplasts have chlorophyll in them, and that's the part of the leaf which absorbs the sunlight. The second main process that leaves do is transpiration. So they control the amount of water that's lost in terms of or that's being used by the plant, and then being lost into the atmosphere after it's being used by the plant. And so just kind of putting that process to work, trying to tie in some of these ideas. So we got sunlight coming in, we got carbon dioxide coming in, and then we'd have water being pulled up into here from the xylem. So what happens there is that within the cells here, now we start to be able to create sugars and become basically food, because we're taking light energy through this process of photosynthesis and now turning it into energy that's ready to be used as sugar. Also, what's happening in there is that now, since the carbon is being used here, we're getting oxygen that can come out, and that's how and that happens through the stomata. So you see that it says stoma here. That's the little hole here, and the stomata is we talked about the lenticels being available as gas exchange on the bark of the tree, whereas stomata are the pores for gas exchange on the leaves specifically. We also have a waxy cuticle on top that's going to help protect our cells here. We got a layer of epidermis, to another layer for protection, and then we've got our cells in here that are doing all the work. Two types of trees. Sometimes we have deciduous trees, which are trees that shed their leaves periodically, which is usually every year in the fall. That's why in the fall we have trees that have such interesting colors. But then we also have evergreen trees, trees that hold on to their leaves for more than 1 year. Now, evergreen trees, it's important to note that doesn't mean that, well, they just grow those one set of leaves and then that stays there forever. Evergreen trees do drop their leaves. They just don't drop them every year. Eventually the leaves will get old and they'll drop off. So look at kind of evergreen versus deciduous. Sometimes because it happens at the end of the year as an adaptation, some deciduous trees aren't going to always have like different weird colors or not have leaves. Sometimes they'll look just fine and normal trees, but then eventually the fall comes around and then the winter comes around and they drop their trees as an adaptation to cold weather climates. It's also an adaptation in terms of just the idea of survival and the idea of energy conservation, and because mostly when you have deciduous trees, most of the time they put out very big leaves, and that takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of energy to support those big leaves. So once it gets to the colder parts of the year, parts of the year where we're not going to get that much light, and it doesn't make sense to have these big, huge leaves, then the tree sheds them. so that then once we get to what always seems like to me St. Patrick's Day, all of a sudden all the leaves are back out because they're like, hey, it's warm enough, I can really get some work done here, so I'm going to put the leaves back out, and this is going to go great. In terms of evergreen trees, you get that year-round foliage, and you usually have much smaller leaves. So for the most part, you're going to see hardwood trees, trees with bigger broadleaf trees are usually deciduous. Evergreen trees, conifers are usually deciduous. So trees with cones, pine trees, fir trees, Douglas firs, redwoods, usually those things fall into the evergreen category. But it's not always that way, right? Because at the beginning we started off with the idea of trees can vary. And then that takes us to the roots. So the roots have 4 primary purposes: anchorage, anchoring the tree into the ground; storage, the storage of minerals and of water; absorption of the minerals and the water within the soil, and having that relationship with the soil that allows them to grab things out of the soil; and then conduction, the idea of then being able to transfer it from where it is in the roots up into the tree. Your larger roots are going to be the ones that are similar to the trunks and the branches, and their main jobs are anchorage, storage, and conduction. So you get things like this, like the sinker roots here, or these oblique heart roots, or the tap roots. Their jobs are anchorage, storage, and conduction. Even these lateral roots, it's all about anchorage, storage, and conduction. Out here, these fine roots, those are our smaller absorbing roots, and those grow at the ends of our larger roots, and those have cells that become modified root hairs, and that's where you get your absorption of the water and minerals that then will eventually be worked and make their way up into the tree. So what else can I tell you about roots? Because roots are pretty interesting to me. Roots grow where moisture and oxygen are available. So if moisture and oxygen aren't available, they're just going to kind of work their way around or keep stretching out until they find something. Most of the absorbing roots, those fine, smaller roots, are found in the upper 12 inches of the soil. Area where the roots join the main stem is the root crown. The roots of trees grown in the open can extend 2 to 3 times the size of the crown. And that's important, because that's, I think, what a lot of people in the urban settings get wrong or don't understand, because they're not putting this tree into a forest full of these trees where it's only going to have a limited space. They're going to put some of these trees like in a backyard or in these other places, and that tree then is going to be able to not have a lot of competition, and it's just going to spread its roots out. And so if you think about how big a tree's canopy is, and then you say, okay, 2 or 3 times that is what's happening underneath the ground, you can then see why in a lot of areas you end up with sidewalks that get kinked up, or problems with roads or buildings or things like that, because people don't understand they've got big, huge root systems working their way underneath all of that stuff. This is also becomes a function of the environment, which is something we're going to definitely focus on in a little bit when we talk about growth. But the idea of how far the roots grow, and what they can or can't do, and all of that, it's all a function of their environment, and how much competition they're getting, how much water they're getting, how much stress the tree is under. All of those sorts of things contribute to the idea of how much are they going to grow. And then you also have the relationship, the symbiotic relationship with fungi in the soil, and that symbiotic relationship is called mycorrhizae. And so if we look here at this picture, on the left here, this is a root system without that symbiotic relationship of mycorrhizae. And on the right, that's mycorrhizae. That's what it looks like. And if you say to yourself, why? What's the benefit of that? Well, remember we talked about those absorbing roots, those fine root hairs that help uptake into the plant from the soil. Well, now instead of just having to rely on its own roots, now you've got this whole kind of web of fungi and root combined that then allows for more uptake and more mineral absorption and more water absorption, and really makes life easier for this plant to grow. So we talked about anatomy. So now we're going to kind of focus on physiology and the idea of the physical processes that that trees grow through. The biggest one is going to be just the idea of both photosynthesis and respiration. So the idea of photosynthesis, sunlight, water, carbon dioxide come in. The water comes in through the soil. Down here, our carbon dioxide, there's plenty of it in our atmosphere, and then we get the sunlight. And because we have that happen, then we've got leaves turning themselves into energy and then creating glucose or sugar, and we get oxygen back into the atmosphere. And then in terms of cellular respiration, so with cellular respiration, the plants use the glucose and the oxygen to produce ATP, carbon dioxide, and water, and that occurs mainly at night. So at night, the process you have is glucose and oxygen producing chemical energy, and then carbon dioxide and water. So you got this kind of just this non-stop system happening of photosynthesis and respiration working together. And so with photosynthesis, if we want to kind of define it, it's the process by which green plants use sunlight to build carbon molecules that make carbohydrates. The carbohydrates then become our sugar or our glucose. Oxygen is released through the stomata in the leaves. Those are the pore openings in the leaves. And then for our respiration, that's the process where the carbohydrates are used by the tree. So it's a constant process of converting food into energy. And why is that important, or how does that also work? It works in the carbon cycle. So we've got our plants producing oxygen, which we breathe and the animals breathe. We got the animals then, or us, breaking down those sugar molecules by eating the food. We're going to release carbon dioxide when we breathe and when we respire, and that then puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere for the plant, and we get this kind of carbon cycle going on. And that's why we need both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and it has to be a circle. That's the way everything works, duality of life, yin and yang, death and birth, the whole duality of life is important. Transpiration we talked about before. It's the loss of water from leaf surfaces through water vapor, and stomatal openings. So the stoma that we talked about before, they are influenced by environmental conditions, and so what they're usually open in light, so open when photosynthesis is happening, and at night when it's dark, they're usually closed. So that's an influence on how the tree, the leaves behave in this instance. So here's a look at transpiration. So you get the roots absorbing water from the soil. The stem draws the water up. That's the xylem pulling it up from the roots. And what happens is, why transpiration is important is because any unused water is going to evaporate from the leaf surface, and then some water is going to get used by the leaf and then become water vapor in this transpiration process. And because we have water leaving, that's what creates this pull up the xylem that makes water want to come and take the place of the other water, because we've got water going out of the system, so we need water to come up because we want it to keep growing, because we want to get big and strong, and we want to try and reach the sun, because that's kind of the way growing in plants works. And so we're going to pull that water up through the xylem, and that's how transpiration is going to work. And so in terms of the growth and development of trees, the big thing that I really want you to understand is it's a result of the interaction between genetic potential and the surrounding environmental conditions. And so you really have to take a holistic view. You have to really think about, and this is going to be important for anybody who's really focused on the idea of trying to become an arborist, is the idea of how, when I look at this tree, don't just look at this tree. What else is going on? What do the roots look like? What does the crown look like? What does the trunk look like? What do the trees next to this tree look like? What does the grass around this tree look like? What kinds of things are growing here? What evidence of animals do we have here? What water conditions do we have? What light conditions do we have? What human conditions or things that aren't natural do we have going on? You have to think about all these different things and how they could possibly be influencing the growth and development of this tree. If we have some sort of problem with the way that the tree is growing, or it's not doing something that's normal, there has to be an explanation for it. And so what is the explanation? And so here's kind of just a look of what I'm talking about. So we can think about something like a forest ecosystem. And we know that there's kind of some natural things to think about. So wind speed and direction, our humidity, our air temperature, our evaporation, our solar radiation, our precipitation, our runoff, our infiltration, our nutrients, our soil temperature, our groundwater table. All things that are natural and that we know are part of all the natural processes, and so we expect those to happen. But then in an urban area, there might be all sorts of other things that we have to think about. Maybe there's some mechanical damage from somebody doing a bad pruning job. Maybe if we live in an area where it snows, there's some salt that's been put on the roads to try and keep the ice down. But then that salt eventually might find its way into the soil. We're going to get increased runoff because there's things built up. We're going to get increased heat because we have things like buildings that are going to reflect light energy and put more light energy onto our trees, which might be a good thing, might be a bad thing. We might also have soil sealing or compaction or limited root space because of roads or houses or driveways or any of these other things. We might have soil contaminants from things that, like pipes or other things that are in there that are not normally seen out in a forest. You also got air pollutants and particulate matter emissions and all sorts of other things to think about. Now, I'm not saying the idea that we can't grow trees in urban areas or that we should be growing more trees in the forest. I do think we should grow more trees in the forest but I also think we should grow more trees in urban areas. But it's just something that as an arborist, you really have to consider the idea that a tree is not going to just grow the same exact way that it would, if you look in the book and it says, okay, well, this tree should grow to 150 feet tall. Maybe it'll grow to 150 feet tall. Maybe it's only going to grow to 30 feet tall. And it might be all these sort of limiting things that could be playing a part in it. But you got to take that holistic view. You got to look at the whole thing. The tree's here. Is it just this one thing? Or maybe it's the mechanical damage and the road salt and the soil compaction and the roots not being able to get deep enough as to why this tree failed. It might not. It's more than likely not going to be a one answer. Oh, it was this one problem. It's probably this, led to that, and then this is how the tree failed. Another way that we could definitely see a difference in terms of growth and development is in the growth form of the tree. So we've got two growth forms. We've got excurrent and decurrent. Excurrent, we have one central leader on our tree. Decurrent, we end up having multiple leaders on our tree, and gives us this more rounded crown look, where we don't get that one strong central leader. We get multiple leaders coming off. It's not, neither one is, in my mind, technically a bad version. I think most of us, when we picture a tree in our mind, we think of like a strong central leader. We think of this more excurrent form. The decurrent form sometimes is evidence of a tree that's got issues going on, but not always. Even in hardwood broadleaf trees, where you think of it as more of this decurrent form, sometimes we can get a nice strong central leader and then just have a lot of branches coming off. When we say decurrent, we're really talking about the idea that there's multiple leaders, and you can't really tell where the midline, that trunk or that bowl of the tree goes. Trees also have defense systems, so we can see some bark right here in this picture that protects the inner wood of the tree. You can also have things like thorns and hairs and thick cuticles and waxy layers and all sorts of other parts that protect the tree. You also have compartmentalization. So that's the idea of trying to limit the spread of disease and decay. And we have this idea of coated, which is compartmentalization of decay in trees. And so what that is that you got this theory that trees will create four walls to try to limit the spread of disease within the tree. And so walls 1 through 3 are part of the reaction zone, where it's the idea that we have this infection or this decay or this disease or this discoloration that's trying to spread through the tree, and we don't want it to spread any further. So we're going to set up these multiple walls of protection against it. Now, sometimes it's going to break through the walls and get through the walls, but usually it won't get through all the walls. And the idea is that if we can get wall 4 established, which is the new wood, and then we can kind of cut it off, and so you can see this idea that, you know, this thing grew and it was able to get farther, but eventually we got it to where it kind of walls it off. So we see that if we can wall it off, we can keep it to where it doesn't spread throughout the tree, and we'll have some good wood. We'll still have an area that got infected, but hopefully not spread through the whole tree. And then the last thing we said that we'd cover in this tree biology section is tropical trees and palms, because they do not have the same biology as the other trees that we talk about. But especially here in California, we're going to talk quite a bit about tropical trees and palms in terms of our urban landscapes. So why are tropical trees and palms different? Well, one of the big differences, they may not have annual growth rings. And it's due to a couple of factors. One is that they have rapid growth. And another one is that they may not experience any dormancy. So because they're tropical and they're used to long growing seasons, and if the climate that they're put into is conducive to that, they just kind of keep growing. There's no reason for them to stop growing. And because of that is this idea that they just keep growing. You can't really see that early wood and late wood in that specific annual ring, because you just see growth, 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 and there's no way to really tell when it stops or starts because there's no slowdown. That was the thing with the early wood and the late wood, and then we know that trees go dormant in the winter. So then you got here's this growth, then here's this slower growth, and then there's no growth. Okay, there's our annual ring. But with a tropical tree, if it's just growing, 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 there's no real way to see that annual growth. In terms of palm trees, I got a little handout here. So if you go into the notes that I gave you, you can click on that and it'll take you to a publication that explains the differences between monocots and dicots. But monocots, a palm is a monocot, and it has more in common biologically with grasses than with the hardwood tree. So even though it's a tree and it has kind of all these parts of it that you think, oh, this is a tree, it's really much more related to grass than it is to trees. Instead of leaves, you have fronds. And what's interesting about the fronds is as the new leaves emerge, the older ones are pushed out and down the tree. Stem wounds are permanent on palms. They don't have a lot of protection on the outside of them. However, they are very resistant to decay because they're super fibrous in terms of the wood that they're producing. And because of that very fibrous nature to them, things try and get into the tree, but they're not usually successful. Most roots are in the upper 12 to 18 inches of soil and are in a root mat. So it's a tight mat that's very close to the trunk. And if you've ever dealt with palms or seen palms, you'll see that the roots are kind of like right there and right next to the trunk. They don't, not this big, huge, spread out, really far bunch of roots. It's just like a mat right around the outside of the trunk. They do resprout very easily though, so that's an interesting feature for palm trees. And so here's a good look at it. For this palm right here, you can see that the roots don't extend super far out from the trunk. This also kind of shows us that idea of what we talked about with the fronds. So as new growth emerges, the new fronds emerge. They emerge up here, so that's the newest frond up there. And then as we go down here, those are the older fronds. And you can see this one that's old and dying off and about to fall off. So that's the newer ones are up at the top, and the older ones are the ones that have been pushed down here out into the bottom. Here's a good look at that idea. So you got your trunk base and you got your roots that don't extend too far from the tree. You got your trunk, you got your fruits, you got your inflorescences, you got your fronds, and you've got similar things to trees, but then also a lot of similarities to grass as well. And that's what I got for you for tree biology. So stick with it, and let's see what else we can learn.